I have a question for you this evening, a trivia question, if you will. In the Bible, what is the very first recorded human question? The answer is found in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 9, when Cain asks the question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Cain was, of course, as we all know, insincere, defensive, and contentious in the way he asked the question. Nevertheless, it doesn't nullify the validity and the importance of the question itself. Cain's attitude was Cain's problem. The question is a very valid question. And so we'll ask that same question this evening as the platform for our Bible study. Are you your brother's keeper? I won't keep you in suspense. The answer to that is a very definite yes, and we'll march through that as we walk through the scriptures this evening in our Bible study. There'll be some portions of the study that I will go through more rapidly than others because we've covered some of the principles and the concepts in a previous series some months ago on the great commandment of the law. So I don't need to walk book, chapter, and verse through everything that we have covered, but I will cover some of the same ground because it's applicable to the question we've asked this evening. But the very first question that we need to ask is, where is God on the topic? Obviously, all of us take our marching orders. We take our guidance. We take our instructions from the conduct and the attitude and the commands of God. So where is God on the topic? The first thing to consider is to walk all the way back to the simplest of realities. God created all of mankind with the hopes that as many as would take him up on the offer, they would have the chance to share with him all of eternity. He is invested, therefore, in every human being ever born, with the hope and with the desire that they will choose from the heart to go the way that he has taught, so that they can share with him all the abundance of his kingdom forever. That's illustrated very clearly in three scriptures that we will look at this evening very briefly. We're all familiar with, and even locally here in the Portland area, this particular scripture has been cited multiple times in the last few months. But John 3:16, very well known to all of us. In fact, I don't even need to quote it to you because it is so well known. But the verse that follows, John 3:17, says this, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." And so the very first concept we start with is Jesus Christ, when he came, his mission wasn't to condemn. His commitment was to see what he could do to save those who are in this world. We understand multiple stages to that, something that is not commonly understood throughout the Christian world. But it doesn't matter which stage we're referring to. The cumulative intent of all the stages is to offer every single solitary human being who has ever lived the best possible chance for salvation. Peter mentions the same in 2 Peter chapter 3 and in verse 9. Peter says the following, 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9, "The Lord is not slack concerning his promises, as some count slackness, but is long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance." If there are those who do not reach salvation, it isn't because God didn't want them to reach salvation. As Peter said, he's really not willing that anyone should perish. Peter and Paul said the same thing in different words. The Apostle Paul, in his first epistle to the evangelist Timothy, said in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4, breaking into the middle of a sentence, but it catches the concept. Speaking of God, it says, who desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. So if God could have his desire, the intent of our being human is that we have the opportunity to make choices, and our choices will determine the ultimate end. But as far as if you ask God, what do I want people to do? He said, my desire is that every single solitary human being would choose to end up in my kingdom. We know that's not going to be, but that is what God desires. So if God cares that much about all humanity, as these three very pointed scriptures demonstrate, how much should we then care? As I said, we take our marching orders from God, and God has said, here's where I am. Well, if that's where he is, then where else can we be? It begs then the question of who is my brother? We are, in the broadest sense of all, we are all brothers by virtue of all being made in God's image. Every single solitary human being comes out of the same factory mold, made in the image of God himself. And as I said a moment ago, every single human being has the opportunity for salvation. The very first substantive teaching on the topic comes when God entered into covenant with ancient Israel. And so the place that we start is where he began dealing with people as a collective group. And that would be at Mount Sinai, as he gave the Ten Commandments and the additional instructions and teachings that followed. If you walk through the beginning, if you walk through the place where God gives the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20, of course we know that they're carved in stone, but metaphorically speaking, before the ink had even dried on the Ten Commandments, God was already into instruction and teaching on brother-to-brother relationships. So Exodus chapter 20, which contains the Ten Commandments, ends, and immediately in Exodus chapter 21, God begins the instruction on how brother should treat brother. The Old Testament law is made of commandments, statutes, and judgments, and the statutes or the judgments are really all the laws that deal with human-to-human relations. And they begin in Exodus chapter 22 and verse 1. So as we look at that very front end of the giving of instruction by God, in Exodus chapter 22, and these are areas that I will not necessarily turn to all of them, but we'll start in Exodus 22. But before we do so, as we walk through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and we ask the question, we ask the question actually from the backside. And what I mean by asking it from the backside is, we look at all the places where God says this is how you should treat another human being. In other words, brother to brother. And then we ask the question, well, who's being referenced here? So it's a backdoor approach. But if we use that backdoor approach and we ask, well, now who's he talking about here? We'll find he's talking about three different categories of human beings. He is talking about the stranger, the neighbor, and the enemy. So he addresses all three of those with instruction that ends up being brother-to-brother instruction. The stranger, the neighbor, and the enemy. So let's start with the stranger. One of the concepts that God reminded Israel of when he began talking about brother-to-brother relationships, he said, you need to remember that you spent a long time in Egypt, and while you were there, you were a stranger. So as you process how you treat other people, you Go back in your mind and look at how you were treated in Egypt as a stranger, and then learn off of that. That was enough on God's mind that between the beginning of Exodus and the end of Deuteronomy, the term stranger comes up 67 times. So the stranger is not a small component in Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. That's a lot of references. Now they don't all deal with conduct, but it's still a lot of references to, quote, the stranger. I'm not going to turn to these. I'll cite them, and I'll cite them just slowly enough. If you're trying to write them down, I'll at least give you a moment to try to capture them. Exodus 22:21. As I said, right out of the gate after the Ten Commandments, we're into brother-to-brother relations. Exodus 22:21, repeated almost verbatim in Leviticus 19:33. So Exodus 22:21, Leviticus 19:33. The command is very direct. Do not vex, and this is the term used, do not vex the stranger. Don't create obstacles for the stranger. Don't make life more difficult for him than it is for you. Don't create obstacles between getting from point A to point B for him because he's a stranger that you don't have to walk through as a natural-born citizen of the country. Do not vex the stranger. Deuteronomy chapter 10. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 18 and 19. He puts it more directly. He says, you are to love the stranger. So it isn't you are to tolerate him, put up with him, coexist with him. He said you are to love the stranger. And then he turns it around the other way to address by inference the person who doesn't love the stranger. And he does that in Deuteronomy 27, verse 19. Deuteronomy 27, verse 19. So in Deuteronomy 10:18, he says you are to love the stranger. In Deuteronomy 27:19, he says, cursed is the person who perverts judgment to the stranger. So if you take the laws that are amenable to both freeborn and stranger, and you make those, you twist and pervert those laws so that they create obstacles for the stranger that aren't there for the freeborn. God doesn't say you shouldn't do that. That's not a good idea. I'd advise you against it. He says, cursed is the man who perverts judgment to the stranger. So he ramps it up beyond just good advice and encouragement to don't go there. Don't go there. So, in addition to that, if you read through the law, you see certain things that come up. The principle of gleaning, which is a brotherly act toward people, to allow the corners of your field to remain unharvested so that somebody can come who is impoverished and gain substance for it. Along with the widow and the orphan, also the stranger had the gleanage rights. We're all familiar with the fact that God in the Ten Commandments says that we are to honor the Sabbath. He says when it comes to keeping the Sabbath, it's not just you and your children and your parents, it's the stranger. So he gets the time off on the Sabbath the same as you get the time off on the Sabbath. We're all familiar from years and years of keeping the Feast of Tabernacles that God's commandment regarding second tithe is that part of its function is so that you can be sure that the widow, the orphan, and the stranger are able to enjoy and celebrate that time with you. So the stranger in all of these areas is treated in a very brotherly manner. Don't aggravate him. Don't make life difficult for him. Genuinely love him. Don't pervert judgment toward him. Allow him to glean with the widows and the orphans. He is to rest with you on the Sabbath, and see financially that he can enjoy and celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles right alongside of you. What about the neighbor? We're going to find, before we're finished with this very brief, we only have two scriptures that we're going to go to, or actually, two scriptural citations. We're going to see that the term neighbor is interchangeable with the term brother. So when I ask, are you your brother's keeper, and we enter the category of neighbor, in the giving of the law, those terms are literally interchangeable. Exodus 21, like I said, the Ten Commandments have just been given, and God has launched into, in Exodus 21 and 22, into laws that relate to brother-to-brother relations. Between Exodus 21:33 and Exodus 22:15, let me say that again. Between Exodus 21:33 and Exodus 22:15, a reasonable chunk of scripture, you can go back and you can read through that portion, and what you're going to see is for instance after for instance after for instance of what is your obligation if some action of yours has caused a loss to your neighbor. And so it may be something you did may have caused one of his animals to be crippled or die. You may have, in some fashion, created a fire that burnt his crops. You may have, and these are all laws of, you may have done this which caused a loss to your neighbor. In some cases, God ramps it up to, you may have deliberately done something, but in all of these cases, there's reparation. So in other words, your neighbor never suffers a loss at your hands without you having the obligation to make good on that loss. And where there's intent involved, God even adds a surcharge, a substantial enough penalty to make a person who is deliberately careless think twice before ever going there again, because it's multiple reparation. It's almost like the court system when they have a judgment and you have damages that are divided into actual cash loss and emotional loss. Those laws, I don't know where they started in our society, but they're very much like God's judgment, where he says, he lost this, so you replace that. That's a comparable. And then you add 3 or 4 or 5 more. This one I will turn to, Deuteronomy chapter 22. Deuteronomy chapter 22. And we'll look at verses 1 through 4. It says, and I cite this one because we talked earlier about neighbor and brother being interchangeable. This is one of those places where you will see the interchangeability. Deuteronomy 22:1 says, you shall not see your brother's ox or sheep going astray. Now this is not your physical brother born from the same mother. This is a brother, a community person, a neighbor. You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray and ignore them. The New King James says, hide yourself from them, and the margin says, ignore it. But you shall certainly bring it back to your brother. How many times in the comings and goings communally do you see on a light post or on a fence that somebody has put a poster up and here's a picture of a dog or a cat that is lost, and a big wanted or have you seen, and a description of an animal that they have lost, in the hopes that you will see it and that you will return it to them. It's a biblical principle. If you see something that has gone astray, he says, you're not to ignore it. You shall certainly bring it back to your brother. He said, if your brother is not near to you, or if you do not know him, which of course in these pet posters that you will see, most often if you actually ever saw the pet, you wouldn't know who owned it anyway. He says, if you don't know the brother, he's not near you, then you bring it to your home and remain with you until you can make that connection with your brother, and then you will restore it to him. And he goes on from there in the next two verses to say you should do the same thing with this animal or that animal. In other words, it isn't specific to a particular creature. It is a principle that applies to any time that you see that your brother has lost something that's living, in this case in Deuteronomy 22, you see that it's restored to your brother. So here's a case where in a previous Bible study, I think it was probably on the Great Commandment series, where I made the point, if you read carefully Deuteronomy 22 verses 1 through 4, you realize that God does not recognize the existence of benign neglect. We live in a world where it's very easy just to turn your head the other way and say, no, it's inconvenient. I don't have time. I don't want to bother. That's too big a worry. I've got other things to do. God here in these verses does not recognize benign neglect. He says, if you see it, solve it. If you see it, take care of it. We're not going to go into it. We've mentioned it in previous studies, the issue of just weights and measures. Today the government controls all of that by regulation and by inspection. But in a day where everybody set their own weights and set their own measures, you could create heavy balances for commodities going one direction and light balances the other direction. And he said, that's an abomination to me. And it's interesting the way he puts it. He doesn't call it just, you ought not do it. If you were to turn back to Proverbs 11, verse 1, in Proverbs 11, verse 1, Solomon says, unjust weights are an abomination to God. You can't get into too many terms more powerful in God's vocabulary than abomination. That's up in the upper echelon of don't go there. And so Solomon in Proverbs 11 verse 1 says, unjust weights are an abomination to God. And you know what? There's a certain common sense to that. I don't know if any of you watch reality shows, but I have over the years watched a number of episodes of a program called American Pickers, a couple of fellows who canvass the United States for antiques in people's garages and barns and old stores, and they get an invitation to come in and look at what's there and see things that they want, and then bargain with the person to say, well, I'd like to have that or that or that or that. And one thing I found very interesting as I've watched some of those episodes is every so often they'll find an individual that's got an item that they really want. And they ask the individual, well, what do you want for it? And the individual says, well, I want so many dollars. And the person who is the antique picker realizes that what that person is asking for that item is so far below its actual value that it's dishonorable to just say, I'll take it. And they'll look the person in the face and say, no, they'll say it in different ways, but I've watched it a few times where they simply tell the person, look, I'm buying this so I can make a profit, and you know that, but you don't know what this is worth, and you are offering to give it to me for so much below what it's worth, I can't in good conscience walk away and take it at that price. So you need to charge me more for what I'm asking. And you think, there's an honorable approach. You can understand in the business, I need to buy it for less than I can sell it for, obviously. Otherwise, why would I be out here doing it? But I can't just simply skin you, and you appreciate the high road. Okay, the third category was the enemy. And we've covered that one in principle before in a previous study, but it's worthy of a review. As we just saw in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 1 through 4, where it talked about restoring to somebody what they had lost, and they referred to him as a brother. We can again go back to just after the Ten Commandments have been given. Now it's in Exodus chapter 23. And in Exodus 23, just 3 chapters after the giving of the Ten Commandments, God is addressing the treatment that you give to an enemy. And it's exactly the same treatment to that enemy that he prescribed for the brother in Deuteronomy chapter 22. And this is how he says it. Exodus 23, verses 4 and 5. Now, instead of your brother's lost animal, it's your enemy's lost animal. So Exodus 23 and verse 4, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you, so we've gone from enemy to somebody who's made it very plain, I have absolutely no use for you. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, if you're going to just simply say, well, that guy hates my guts, that's his problem, serves him right, walk on around it, he says, stop right there. You shall surely help him with it. So when we ask the question, am I my brother's keeper, in the setting of the giving of the law in covenant to Israel, the answer is a very straightforward answer. Whether it happened to be a stranger, whether it happened to be a neighbor / brother, whether it happened to be an enemy, all the commands and all the laws said, you treat him as if he were a brother. Stranger, neighbor, enemy, all the same. As I've said before, the laws given Israel were simple. They were understandable. They were practical. Even to this very time in life, we're now over 3,500 years later, they are still very practical, and in many cases they're embedded in civil codes in most of the Western nations of the United States. So you can go throughout the Western world, Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and many of these things are embedded in the codes that are administered within the nations themselves. What about the church? So we moved out of the Old Testament into the New Testament. Are there additional ways a Christian is told he has a brother's keeper relationship with members of the church? The answer is absolutely. Absolutely. One of the tells, one of the signs that just stands up there in great big bold letters is how all of us automatically see and address ourselves collectively. As members of the church, what are we? Brethren. When a pastor speaks to the church, what does he say? Brethren. No, it's not modern English, but he's just saying, you are my brothers. All of us have a brother-to-brother relationship. Before God, we are all brothers. And so the very vocabulary of the church is the vocabulary of brothers. In anticipation of the creation of the church, Christ made a most sobering statement in Matthew 18:3-6. And that one we should go back and take a look at, because even though the church had not started, and it wasn't going to start until after his death, the language that he used in Matthew chapter 18, verses 3 through 6, anticipates the creation of the church by the terminology used. Matthew 18, verse 3, Christ says, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted." Now, obviously, we have entered church vocabulary. There's no conversion before the church. "Assuredly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." This is the conversion process and its destination. "Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom, and whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depths of the sea." A very sobering comment that precedes the coming of the establishment of the church. We're going to spend the rest of the study on one issue, as it is pivotal to the issue of being a brother's keeper and is covered in great detail by Paul in his letter to the Romans and the Corinthians. So we only need one example, and this one is massive. It takes up the entirety of Romans 14, the entirety of Romans 8, and a section of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. So Romans 14, 1 Corinthians 8, piece of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I'll have to start out by laying foundation, because it's unfortunate that Romans chapter 14, which is the only one we will cover this evening, has become a doctrinal battleground among Christian denominations who have used this area to do away with the Bible's teaching on keeping the Sabbath and the holy days and the dietary laws. And so they have made it a battleground where, we put our flag in the ground and we use this area in Romans 14 to say you don't have to keep the holy days, you don't have to keep the Sabbath, and you don't have to mind the dietary laws. Unfortunately, turning Romans 14 into that kind of battleground leaves in the dark shadows the most impactful, important part of Romans chapter 14. So we're going to get the battlefield out of the way and off the table so that we can look at what's hiding in the shadows, which is totally and completely from the beginning of Romans 14 all the way into 2 verses into Romans 15 about being your brother's keeper. The issues in Romans 14, let's turn back there because that's where we're going to spend the rest of the Bible study. The artificial battlefield that has been created by denominational Christianity is found in 3 verses. Romans chapter 14 and verse 3. Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. And they coupled that verse with verse 14. I know and am convinced by the Lord Jesus that there is nothing unclean of itself, but to him who considers anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. This is the battlefield that does away with the dietary laws. Verse 5 is used to do away with the Sabbath and the holy days. One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes a day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord, for he who gives God thanks, and he who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat and gives thanks. And this has become, as I said, a denominational battlefield to do away with dietary laws, Sabbaths, and holy days, and all of these are invalid arguments. So that we understand what the battlefield actually is. This whole section, combined with 1 Corinthians chapter 8, is literally about members of the Church of God who cannot in good conscience eat meat due to its connection with the temple, idols. It's the whole topic of Romans 14. It's the whole topic of 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and also of chapter 10. The problem with their conscience was the fact in Corinthians that animals sacrificed in temples in some cases were only partially sacrificed. The remainder of the meat on that animal was either given to the person who had made the sacrifice, or they were kept by the priests and used for revenue. If they were kept by the priests, they were sold to the meat market, and they were sold just like you'd go down to Fred Meyer, Safeway, Albertson, or anywhere else and buy meat over the meat counter. If they were kept by the individual, they were for celebration among family members, sometimes within the precincts of the temple itself. I won't go there, but if you study the temple in Ezekiel, which is a millennial temple, there are literally on the corners of that temple grounds, on the four corners, kitchens. And those kitchens are for the purpose that people who have brought animals for sacrifice, who can, such as in the peace offering, keep a portion of the sacrifice, can then sit down and celebrate with friends and family and eat that fine meat menu. Not a whole lot different in pagan times, only those were sacrificed to Zeus, to Apollo, to Aphrodite, to who knows who. Also, additionally, in the Roman world, there was the practice of asceticism among the pagans, and asceticism of its own brand among the Pharisees. You remember the boastful Pharisee that says, "I'm not like this publican. I fast twice in the week, every week, 2 days a week." He was boasting that he fasted, an ascetic practice. The pagans had their same counterparts. Just to make this one amply clear, I'll give you a comment from the a search engine comment. This popped up on Bing when I was doing a search, and it said it as well as anything. Quote, "The practice of abstaining from meat on Friday is an ancient tradition dating back to the early centuries of Christianity. In the 2nd century AD, a dispute arose in the church over whether Christians should fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. This controversy heightened the growing interest in abstinence as a form of spiritual discipline even in the early church. By the 3rd century AD, abstaining from meat and wine on certain days was an established practice linked to fasting and penance. For example, the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD spoke of the importance of abstinence to all Christians. These were the issues in Romans 14. I was chuckling talking recently with someone on the phone, and they said they were born in 1965, and I laughed and I said, "You're actually too young to have experienced the modern parallel." In 1966, the U.S. Catholic bishops removed a commandment obligatory on all American Catholics, and that was that as a sin, they were not to eat any meat on Fridays. And so those who are my age are very familiar with the fact that Friday was fish day, and no Catholic could eat red meat on a Friday. And that still exists throughout the world. The American bishops were the only one that took an action to change that. If you wish to study this particular further, because I said I'm not going to go any further, you have the foundation here. But if you want to look at these scriptures more in depth, let me recommend that you go to 2 historic documents. One would be the July-August 1983 Plain Truth magazine. July 1983 Plain Truth magazine. And you'll see an article entitled, "Is All Animal Flesh Good for Food?" And it'll walk through Romans 14. The other is September 1960, Good News. article entitled, "Does It Matter Which Days We Keep?" And it will go through the other issue in Romans 14. So if you want to do a personal study to flesh out the background that I gave you for where we're going, you can dive into the July-August 83 Plain Truth and the September 1960 Good News. So what is it that Paul is dealing with? He's dealing with members with tender consciences, members who have trouble being able to eat meat bought in the market or eat meat left over from a sacrifice to an idol, and members who have a conscience trained to fast on certain days as a part of their religious practice, being argued with that that practice is something they ought not do. With this as the setting, what did Paul teach all those members of the congregations in Rome? And the same teaching would have been given in Corinth about how do you treat a person with that tender conscience. You know, brethren, I was thinking as I was preparing this Bible study that as we walk through this, you can say, well, you know, we don't have multiple fast days in a week, and we're not into idols' temples and meat sacrifice to idols. Let me give you something modern and current so that you can plug all the advice into something that we've all been through in the last 5 years. The amount of judgmentalism during the COVID period was phenomenal throughout society, and the church was not immune from the same thing. People of one persuasion, people of a different persuasion, and the tendency or the temptation to judge the other's conduct as inferior to your conduct. So as we walk through idols and temples and days of abstinence, just plug in COVID conduct, and I think you'll have a relevancy. Romans 14, this is what Paul said to the congregation in Rome about how to treat an individual who struggled with eating clean animal flesh of animals that in portion had been sacrificed at the temple of an idol in their community. Verse 1, receive one who is weak in the faith, but do not dispute over doubtful things. This individual was not weak in the faith, as the verse says. If you go to any commentary, it'll tell you it is talking of someone who is weak in faith. It's on point, it's on issue, and the issue is the entirety of Romans 14. On this particular point, I have scruples. I have problems. I am wrestling with this. He says, don't receive someone who is struggling with this particular element to doubtful disputation. Cambridge commentary regarding doubtful disputation says, do not receive this individual to criticism. In other words, you know that he doesn't see this the same way you do. And so you set him up. You ask him a leading question. The leading question is so that he will reveal how he feels, so that you can criticize what he's doing, because what you think you're doing is better than what he's doing. Paul says, don't do that. Don't bring this fellow toward you. Don't receive him, and then set him up for a critique. Paul says, don't enter a conversation for the purpose of detecting how his opinion differs from yours, so that you can criticize his scruples. Now, I know scruples is not a term that's a part of our normal vocabulary, but scruples simply means feelings of doubt or hesitation with regards to the morality or the propriety of a course of action. And these individuals were wrestling with scruples. So, verse 1, summary is very simple. Don't enter a conversation with a brother so that you can put down his hesitation to do things that you feel fine about. And the thought carries seamlessly over to the next verse of instruction, which is verse 4, where Paul asks the question, who are you to judge another's servant? If I look across to any congregation that I'm a part of or that you're a part of, everybody there is my equal in God's eyes. He's my brother, I'm his brother. God says, who are you to judge him? You're not above him, you're on a plane with him. He stands or falls to me. I'm the master. And so he says, who are you to judge another servant? To his own master he stands or falls. And the illusion is, I'm the master of all of you. You will answer to me. You do not answer to each other. So don't judge each other. That's my job. He goes on to Romans chapter 14 and verse 10. He asks the question, but why do you judge your brother, or why do you show contempt for your brother? Now he enters a new element. He started out with, don't set your brother up so that he will say something that you can then criticize or put down. He follows it with, consider the realities. You're not above him, you're on parity with him. You all answer to me, none of you answer to each other. So leave his business alone and have him leave yours alone. But as he continues that same thought, he then brings in the issue of contempt. You ever looked at somebody when you've said something about what you believe and you get that look on the face that's condescending? Maybe it's a curled lip, maybe it's a look out of the corner of the eye, maybe it's a grin that's not a grin of humor or delight, but a grin of, why do you have that problem? You shouldn't have that problem. He says, don't show contempt. There's no reason in your language, in your look, in your body language that you should demonstrate to a brother because he wrestles with something that he shouldn't be there. That's not, as Paul is saying to the members in Rome, that's not your business. He said, leave it to me. He said, you worry about your problems and leave his problems to me, and I'll worry about his problems. And he said, we got an arrangement. I'll worry about his problems, you worry about your problems. Verse 13. We get into therefores, and there are a couple of therefores, and as Paul does, if you read Paul well, you know that Paul is one that will talk for a while and then he'll sum it up. And then he'll talk for a while, then he'll sum it up. And his telltales are therefores and wherefores. So here's a therefore in verse 13. Therefore, so he's summing up everything he's been teaching up to this point. Therefore, let us not judge one another any longer, but rather resolve. That's a nice word. In other words, sit down, think this through, and create a stance. Therefore, resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in our brother's way. Harken back to Christ's statement in Matthew about putting stumbling blocks. Now we're back to stumbling blocks. And he says, make yourself a New Year's resolution. Your resolution should be, I need to sit back. I need to look at anything that I don't agree with that is a part of my brother's wrestlings in his Christian life. And my resolution is, don't make his challenge any greater than it already is. Don't put anything in front of him that makes it even harder to walk the path than he's already walking the path. Don't put any stumbling blocks in his path. So Paul says that should be the resolution that you make. Verse 15, we get into a few specifics. If your brother's grieved because of your food, you are no longer walking in love. Do not destroy with your food the one for whom Christ died. Ooh, now he meddles. He says if something you do causes this person grief, stop doing it. I began the ministry in Alabama. An awful lot of people, an awful lot of very, very religious people believed you were going to burn forever in hell fire if you consumed alcohol. When God called them into his church, you had a challenge. This had been their culture all their life. They were now entering a church where if they only did it once a year, they'd still be taking wine for Passover. You dealt with the most tender possible way with these people. The worst thing you could do is sit down and look them in the face and say, well, there's nothing wrong with alcohol. You made sure with people in that particular situation, because of where their conscience was, that you respected their conscience in every possible way you could. We don't have as many that come into the Church of God from, let's say, a Seventh-day Adventist type background where vegetarianism is a part of the religion. But it's the same situation. I wouldn't invite a brand new person who just came into the church out of a strong Adventist background over to my house for a meal with meat on the menu. It's simply wrong. My wife spent some time when we lived in Seattle. We had a doctor who specialized in something in Adventist here in Portland, and we made multiple trips from Seattle to Portland so she could see her doctor. And she finally was admitted to the hospital, and I was quite fascinated, and I appreciated the beauty of the Adventist approach. If I went down in the cafeteria in Adventist hospital, everything was vegetarian. If I wanted to eat in their cafeteria, the only thing in the cafeteria was vegetarian. Upstairs in the room where my wife was, the tray that came to her room had vegetables and meat. They didn't impose their belief upon the patients, and they expected that you would respect their beliefs when you ate with them in their cafeteria. A very beautiful balance in practicing Romans chapter 14. Romans 14 and verse 19 and 20. Another therefore. Therefore, let us pursue the things which make for peace, and the things by which one may edify another. Do not destroy the work of God for the sake of food. Don't, in your piety, look down your nose at somebody else and make an issue in an area of this sort that literally makes a brother to stumble over something as inconsequential in the whole scheme of things as this. So he said, don't destroy. You notice how God makes it personal. Don't destroy my work. I'm working with this person that you think is weak, just the same as I'm working with you. I'm invested in both of you. I want to see both of you in the kingdom. If you make life hard for him, you're making life hard for me. That's God speaking. He says, don't destroy the work that I'm doing with this man or woman. So as I said, do not destroy the work of God for the sake of food. Powerful, powerful statement. He tells you in this particular verse, verse 19, pursue. This isn't passive. This isn't, okay, I just won't bring it up. This is find ways that you can make life easier for someone who struggles with something in any of these categories. It's both proactive and reactive. Don't reactively do what's wrong, but proactively try to make things easier. Brings us to verses 21 and 22, which are in one sense a crux. Verse 21, it is good neither to eat meat, nor drink wine, nor to do anything by which your brother stumbles, or is offended, or is made weak. Do you have faith? Have it to yourself before God. That's between you and God. If you have faith and you feel good about your faith, well, you and God can enjoy that. You can talk about it. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves. This is two-sided on this being happy not to condemn yourself. It's a situation where you're happy that you don't have those problems. The other side of the coin is you should be happy that you're not creating problems for him. So you can be happy. You can be happy either way. And both are legitimate. You can be happy you don't have the struggle. You can also be happy that you haven't made his struggle more challenging and more difficult. But that verse 21 is a powerful verse. He said, "It is good neither to eat meat nor drink wine, nor do anything by which your brother stumbles or is offended or made weak." I gave you a couple of illustrations. If you knew that you had somebody who truly had a conviction that they can't eat meat, and you invited them to your home, the worst thing you could do and the most unchristian thing you could do would be serve meat. Wine, exactly the same way. I have friends who have struggled with alcoholism. Always make sure with a friend who is a recovering alcoholic that my conduct is completely and totally acceptable to them. You know, what works for you? And that's the marching order. It isn't a matter of saying, well, I don't have the problem. That's your problem. No, their problem is my problem. I am my brother's keeper. We live in a day and time when one of the most polarized and emotionally fraught issues in American life are quote unquote my rights. And people go on the bandwagon about my rights. We have just seen in Romans chapter 14, God says, your rights are not as important as your responsibilities to your brother. If you want to walk to me and talk about the responsibility to be your brother's keeper on one hand and your rights on the other hand, you need to understand that with me, your responsibility to your brother is greater than your rights. And that's what Paul has been saying from verse 1 all the way down to where he closes the topic in the first two verses of chapter 15. We then, this sums up the whole topic, we then who are strong, in other words, we're not wrestling with anything, ought to bear with the scruples of the weak and not to please ourselves. Those are the marching orders. We then who are strong, we're not wrestling with this issue. We bear with, we help carry their burden when they have challenges and subjugate our own personal pleasures. We who are strong ought to bear with the scruples of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, leading to building him up. I asked the question at the beginning, a trivia question. What is the very first question asked by a human being in the Bible? And there in Genesis chapter 4, Cain asked the question, am I my brother's keeper? His was insincere. Ours this evening in Bible study is completely and totally sincere. From start to finish, the beginning of scriptural teaching and instruction to the very end, the answer to that question is yes. We are our brother's keeper.